What would you do if your parents were murdered? This question haunted a young boy named Kofi every day. He was just 11 years old, with dark skin that glowed like polished wood and bright eyes full of dreams. Kofi lived in a small village with his mother, Yasmin, and his father, Ahmed. They were a loving family and always looked out for each other. One evening, after a long day of school, Kofi returned home. The smell of his mother's delicious cooking filled the air. He could hear laughter as he walked in, and his heart felt warm. He joined his parents at their small table, sharing stories about his day and laughing together. But that happiness didn't last long. Suddenly there was a loud bang outside. The door flew open, and two angry men stormed inside. Kofi's father stood up quickly, his face a mix of fear and anger. "Who are you? What do you want?" his father demanded. One of the men shouted, "We know what you have. Where is it?" Kofi's mother stepped forward, trying to protect her family, but the men pushed her aside. Kofi watched in horror as they struggled with his father. Just as Kofi wanted to scream, he heard the loudest noise he had ever heard, and everything went dark. When Kofi woke up, he was sitting on the floor next to his parents, who were no longer moving. The lively home was now filled with silence. The room felt cold and empty, and Kofi's heart broke into pieces. The men who had come in were gone, and it seemed like no one cared about what had happened. The next morning, villagers found Kofi sitting alone, tears streaming down his face. They called the police, but the officers seemed indifferent to his pain. They scribbled some notes and just walked away, leaving Kofi terrified and alone. Days went by, but Kofi's sadness never left him. He had no one to care for him, so he started working around the village. He picked up trash and helped in the market. People often teased him because of his dark skin. They didn't see the bright spirit that Kofi had inside him. But he didn't let their harsh words bother him. He stayed focused on one thing: finding justice for his parents. Every night, Kofi would sit alone and remember how happy they once were. He thought about the men who had taken them away from him. He was determined to find out who they were and why they had done this terrible thing. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he promised himself that he would never give up. As time passed, Kofi became a teenager who worked hard to keep the memory of his parents alive. While picking up trash one day, a kind teacher named Mr. Samuel noticed him. He saw the spark in Kofi's eyes and offered to help. Mr. Samuel began tutoring Kofi after school. Slowly, Kofi improved in his studies and began to dream of becoming a lawyer. He wanted to fight for justice, not just for his parents, but for everyone who had been hurt. Kofi studied hard and graduated from school. He enrolled in a law program, working tirelessly to get an education. But even in school he faced challenges. Some people still judged him for his skin color, and they would often try to undermine his ideas. Kofi felt defeated at times, but he remembered his parents and their love. He refused to let anyone take away his dream. Kofi's journey to becoming a lawyer was filled with ups and downs. He went through the struggles of learning the law, but his determination was strong. The thought of standing in a courtroom one day and speaking up for those who couldn't made him fight hard in life. Finally, after years of hard work, Kofi found himself facing incredible challenges in the highest court of the land. He encountered a judge who did not want to listen to him because of his race. Kofi felt a mix of anger and fear as he began to uncover a deeper connection between the judge and the men who had harmed his family. With every step, Kofi knew he had to be brave. He felt the weight of his parents' spirits pushing him forward, urging him to keep going. Even when it seemed like no one believed him, he stood tall. Kofi's fight for justice was only beginning, and he knew that the road ahead would not be easy. But he felt a spark of hope inside him, like a small fire that couldn't be snuffed out. He was ready to face whatever came next, determined to bring light to the darkness that had taken so much from him. What would you do if your parents were murdered? Kofi knew what he would do. He would fight, and he would never stop until justice was served. As the sun rose over the village, casting long shadows across the muddy paths. Kofi grabbed his tattered backpack and stepped outside. The world around him felt vast, but at the same time, it was weighed down by the burdens he carried. After losing his parents, life took on a new meaning, one filled with struggle and pain. Kofi found himself growing up in poverty, often feeling like he was in a constant battle against the world. Every morning, Kofi would scavenge through the market where people tossed away scraps of food and broken items. It wasn't much, but he made a meager living by collecting plastic bottles, old paper, and anything else that could be sold or reused. By the end of the day, Kofi would return home, worn out and covered in dirt, but with pockets that held enough coins to buy a small meal. "Look at him," some children would shout as Kofi walked by, their laughter ringing in the air. "The trash boy. Does he even have any parents?" Their ridicule stung like sharp thorns, but Kofi learned to ignore them. He had to because deep down he knew he was more than what they called him. While he picked through garbage under the hot sun, he also picked up bits of knowledge from conversations he overheard. Sometimes he would hear adults talking about the crooked people in power, the ones who got away with murder like the men who had stolen his parents away. In the evenings, after a hard day's work, Kofi would sit outside his small hut and look up at the stars. They twinkled like diamonds against the canvas of the night. More than anything, he longed for justice, for the truth to come to light, and to make his parents proud. But the steep hill of life encumbered him. Every time he tried to climb, he would stumble back down, faced with insults and challenges. Kofi's dark skin became a target. Some people treated him poorly because of it. They would call him names or look the other way when he asked for help. Kofi often wondered why people couldn't see beyond the color of his skin. Didn't they know he was just a boy yearning for love, safety, and understanding? He would shake off the harsh comments, reminding himself that he had dreams far too big to be crushed by the short-sightedness of others. Determined to change his circumstances, Kofi promised himself that education would be the key to unlocking his future. Each day, he snuck into the back of Mr. Samuel's classroom. When the teacher noticed him, he didn't kick him out but instead welcomed him to stay and listen. Kofi felt a spark of hope ignite in his heart. Learning gave him strength, and knowledge allowed him to dream of a brighter future. Despite the challenges he faced daily, Kofi found small pockets of joy. Sometimes, he would walk by a flower stall and marvel at the vibrant blooms. He would catch the scent of fresh bread from the bakery and imagine what it would be like to taste it. On some days, Mr. Samuel would invite him to join other students for lunch. They shared food, laughter, and stories. Though Kofi was still poor, he began to realize he was rich in spirit. Yet, with every moment of happiness, there were reminders of his harsh reality. He felt the weight of his humble status like a heavy cloak. When he walked through the village, people would whisper and look at him with pity. They saw him, the trash boy, and not Kofi, the determined future lawyer. "There he goes again, picking up scraps," an elderly woman would say with disdain. Yet, Kofi simply smiled back, knowing that one day he would rise up from the ashes of his struggles. One particular day left a lasting impression on him. While sorting through discarded goods, Kofi spotted a shiny object buried in the clutter, an old pocket watch. It was tarnished but beautiful. He cleaned it with his shirt and realized that it still ticked softly. In that moment, Kofi found a symbol of hope. Like the watch, he understood that even in the darkest conditions, life continued moving forward. Kofi wore the pocket watch around his neck and promised himself to keep time on his side. He focused even more on his studies with Mr. Samuel. Each lesson learned was like another tick of the watch, a reminder that time was precious. He might have been mocked and treated poorly, but Kofi wouldn't let that define him. His mind filled with the hopes of a brighter future. He pressed on, determined to find the truth that would render justice for his parents and for himself. No matter how heavy the burdens became, Kofi realized he had a fire within him that would not dim. He would fight against the darkness of poverty, racism, and mockery, fueled by the memory of his parents and his unyielding will to change his destiny. As he headed home from work that evening, the stars above seemed to wink at him, as if they knew every hardship he faced and pushed him to dream even bigger. Kofi was ready to take on the world, one day at a time. As days turned into weeks, Kofi continued to navigate the rough waters of life in his village. Each dawn brought new challenges, but he carried the small, ticking pocket watch around his neck as a reminder of his dreams. It wasn't until a particularly hot afternoon that a moment would change his life forever. Kofi had just finished a long day of sorting through trash and was making his way towards the shade of a large mango tree when he noticed a small gathering of students outside the school. They were laughing and sharing stories while clutching their books, their faces bright with excitement. Feeling a pang of longing, Kofi stood at a distance, wishing he could join them. Just then Mr. Samuel, the teacher he admired from afar, spotted Kofi. With a warm smile, he waved the boy over. "Kofi, come here. I've been wondering why I never see you in class. You should be learning with the others." Kofi hesitated, anxiety washing over him. I'm poor, sir. I can't afford to go to school," he stammered, looking down at his worn shoes. Mr. Samuel knelt down beside him. "It doesn't matter how much money you have. What matters is your desire to learn. You have a bright mind, Kofi. Can see that. Come to class with me. The knowledge you gain can help you change your life." Taking a deep breath, Kofi felt a wave of hope wash over him. Slowly he nodded. "Okay, I will try." From that day on, Kofi found himself in Mr. Samuel's classroom every afternoon after finishing his work. The classroom was lively, filled with laughter and the rustle of turned pages. Mr. Samuel spoke with passion, and Kofi was captivated by the world of knowledge that lay before him. With every lesson, Kofi discovered something new. He learned about history, math, and science, and with Mr. Samuel's encouragement, he began to excel. It was in social studies that Kofi revealed his true thoughts and ideas, often sharing stories of injustice and inequality in his village. Mr. Samuel quickly noticed Kofi's passion for standing up for what was right. "You have a natural talent for this, Kofi," Mr. Samuel said one day as they sat together, the sun streaming through the classroom window. "You have the spirit of a leader. Have you ever thought about becoming a lawyer?" Kofi's eyes widened at the possibility. A lawyer. The word held a powerful weight in his mind. The more he considered it, the more he realized this was his calling. "But how can I ever become a lawyer?" he asked, uncertainty clouding his thoughts. "I have no money, and no one believes I can do it." Mr. Samuel placed a reassuring hand on Kofi's shoulder. "I believe you can. You have what it takes. Let's work together. I will help you apply for scholarships. You will need dedication and hard work, but I know you can do it." Supported by Mr. Samuel's guidance, Kofi began to flourish. He studied late into the night, the light of a small kerosene lamp illuminating the pages of his books. The evenings were often filled with questions, clarifications, and a burning desire to learn. He spent hours poring over legal texts, articles, and stories of great leaders who had fought for justice. His evenings were hard, but Kofi felt a strength building within him. He would sit at that small table in his hut, determined to understand every word. Each new idea filled him with energy, and he would dream of standing in front of a judge one day, speaking for those who had no voice. Months passed, and his laughter began to return. Kofi became friends with other students and was accepted into their circle. They no longer saw him as the trash boy, but as Kofi, their intelligent and determined classmate. Together they studied and helped each other, creating a sense of community Kofi had longed for. Still, the shadows of his past lingered. In quiet moments, he would think of his parents and the happiness they had shared. He wanted justice for them more than anything. With each encouraging word from Mr. Samuel and every kind gesture from his classmates, Kofi felt their support lend him wings. The day came when Mr. Samuel announced that he had found a scholarship opportunity for Kofi to attend a prestigious law school in the city. "This is it," Mr. Samuel exclaimed, his eyes shining with excitement. "This could be your chance to become a lawyer." Kofi's heart raced. Excitement and fear swirled within him. "But what if I fail?" he asked, the doubt creeping back. Mr. Samuel smiled and said, "Every great journey begins with a single step, Kofi. You have already taken so many steps. Trust in yourself and let your passion guide you." With those words echoing in his mind, Kofi made the decision. He applied for the scholarship and poured every bit of energy into preparing for the entrance exams. He studied tirelessly, determined to make his dreams a reality. Finally, the day of the exam arrived. The classroom was filled with nervous students, but Kofi felt a calmness wash over him. He remembered Mr. Samuel's faith in him, and it fueled his determination. He tackled the questions with vigor, channeling all his hopes and dreams into those pages. When the results were announced weeks later, Kofi's heart pounded in his chest. As he scanned the list of names, his eyes finally landed on his own. It was there. His name shone like a beacon of hope. He couldn't believe it. He had been awarded the scholarship. With tears of joy in his eyes, Kofi felt an enormous weight lift off his shoulders. This was just the beginning of his journey to fight for justice, not only for his parents but for countless others who had suffered injustice. He turned to Mr. Samuel, whose proud smile made Kofi's heart swell with gratitude. "Thank you, sir," Kofi whispered. "You believed in me when no one else did." Mr. Samuel nodded. "You did this, Kofi. Remember, your journey is only beginning. Keep working, keep believing, and fight for what is right." With newfound determination, Kofi prepared to step into a new world, promising himself that he would never forget where he came from. The clock was ticking, and Kofi was ready to seize the time and shape his destiny as a lawyer. His journey for justice had just begun, the moment Kofi stepped into the grand courtroom. He felt the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. The polished wooden floors, high ceilings, and rows of chairs filled with spectators served as a stark reminder that he was not just any lawyer. He was a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced for too long. Yet, despite his education and fierce determination, Kofi knew that the battle ahead would be unlike anything he had ever faced. His first case was one filled with promise, an opportunity to represent a young man, Malik, who had been wrongfully accused of theft. It was the classic story of racial profiling, and Kofi felt his heart race as he envisioned the impact they could make. He had spent hours preparing for this moment, poring over legal texts while rehearsing his arguments in front of the mirror. He was ready. As the trial commenced, Kofi stood before the judge, feeling the heat of the spotlight. He could see the cold, steely gaze of the prosecutor, Ms. Hartfield, a relentless woman known for her unyielding stance against any defense. But Kofi focused on Malik, seated beside him, and the hope in his eyes fueled Kofi's resolve. "My client Malik is an honest young man who has never crossed the line into crime," Kofi stated, his voice steady. "The accusations against him stem not from evidence, but from prejudice. He was profiled because of his appearance. We must not allow this blatant infringement on his rights to dictate the outcome of this trial." As Kofi spoke, he was met with skepticism. The judge, a stern older man with a lined face, leaned back in his chair, unimpressed. He cast a sideways glance, and Kofi could feel the invisible barriers that had been erected around him. Tension rose as Ms. Hartfield seized the opportunity to attack. "Your Honor, let's not forget the facts here. Malik has a record. This is not merely a racial issue. This is a question of character," she began, her voice dripping with disdain. Kofi felt a lump in his throat as the courtroom buzzed with murmurs. The undercurrents of prejudice and bias were palpable. It was as if everyone, including the judge, were casting their judgments before Kofi could even present his full case. He knew he needed to rise above the dismissed glances and the condescending tones. "No one is above scrutiny, Ms. Hartfield," he replied, fighting the urge to let his frustration show. "But to judge my client solely based on his past and the color of his skin is to ignore the very principles of our justice system. It is about due process, not preconceptions." As the trial progressed, Kofi called witnesses, shared evidence, and laid out a compelling argument that emphasized Malik's innocence. Yet, even his most convincing points seemed lost in a sea of prejudice. The courtroom echoed with reminders that racial bias still played a significant role in the legal system. Day after day, Kofi faced the relentless challenges of fighting against not only the evidence but societal perceptions that sought to undermine his arguments. The verdict loomed, and dread seeped into his heart, the feeling that even his outstanding education might not be enough in the face of deep-rooted injustice. The day the verdict was announced, Kofi stood beside Malik, engulfed in a mixture of hope and trepidation. As the judge's gavel came down, the words echoed throughout the courtroom. Not guilty felt like a fleeting dream. But the judge quickly followed with, however, this decision comes with a conditional understanding that the evidence is circumstantial, given Mr. Malik's previous record. The breath Kofi had been holding escaped him in a frustrated sigh. He turned to Malik, whose face fell in dismay. No true justice had been served. The subtle way in which the judge dismissed the case felt like 100 blades lacerating Kofi's resolve. Back at his modest office, Kofi stewed over the outcome, grappling with the bitter taste of defeat. No matter how prepared he was, no matter how compelling his case, there seemed to be an invisible wall he could not break through. His dark skin, his humble beginnings, and the weight of societal prejudice overshadowed his every effort. As nights turned into weeks, Kofi struggled with doubts that began to creep into his mind. What am I doing wrong? He pondered. But deep down he understood. It wasn't him who was flawed. It was a broken system that preferred to uphold prejudice and bias. Yet, through the dismay, a spark lingered within him. He recalled the countless hours he had spent learning, always guided by that initial fire to seek justice for those who couldn't fight for themselves. More than ever, he felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had to continue fighting, not just for Malik, but for all those who had been silenced. Every great lawyer faces defeat, he reminded himself, recalling the encouragement of Mr. Samuel. This is just one battle in a larger war. With newfound determination, Kofi made a promise to himself. He wouldn't allow his circumstances to define him. He wouldn't allow the biases of others to dim his passion for justice. Kofi returned to the courthouse, not to cower in defeat but to educate and advocate tirelessly against injustice. He began to gather stories from people in the community, the anecdotes of those whose lives had been ravaged by prejudice. Kofi not only wanted to be their lawyer but also became their voice. With each case that followed, some won, some lost, Kofi knew that real change required more than just winning in court. It required raising awareness about the underlying biases that stifled the truth. He organized rallies, spoke at public meetings, and engaged with community members. He sought to elevate their stories, amplifying the call for equality while also confronting the very prejudices that had sought to silence him. Kofi refused to be discouraged. His fire grew brighter, fueled by the stories of injustices faced by those around him, and a greater purpose began to take shape. As he looked at the faces of those who had gathered to support him, he realized that he was not alone in his fight. Together, they formed a community determined to challenge the old narratives. Victory in the courtroom might come slowly, but gradually the tide began to turn. Justice was not just a concept, it was a collective effort, a movement that Kofi had now become a vital part of. With each case, each act of advocacy, he took another step toward dismantling the prejudices that ruled the courtrooms. Kofi tightened his grip on the pocket watch he always wore, a reminder of his journey and the time he would use to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. He had battles to face, but as long as he stood firm in his pursuit, he knew true justice was within reach. And as he entered the courtroom on that hopeful morning, he was filled with the unwavering belief that he could change the world, one case at a time. Weeks went by, as Kofi continued his crusade against injustice, taking on one challenging case after another. His victories might have been limited, but the impact of his efforts on the community was palpable. People began to take notice of the young, determined lawyer, who refused to give up in the face of adversity. Word of his unyielding passion for justice spread, and soon, he found himself at the doorstep of the esteemed Supreme Court of America, the highest court in the land. His client, Ms. Thompson, a 75-year-old black woman, stood before the bench, her wrinkled hands shaking as she recounted the story of how her son had been wrongly arrested, beaten, and locked away for a crime he hadn't committed. Kofi listened intently, a deep sense of outrage burning within him. As they approached the trial, Kofi couldn't help but feel an eerie sense of familiarity with the atmosphere that surrounded them. He had heard whispers about Judge Reginald, the presiding judge for their case, who had a long history of racial bias. It seemed that Judge Reginald wasn't only against black people. He was against any case that challenged the status quo, especially those involving racial injustice. As the trial began, Kofi presented his case with conviction, armed with evidence and a wealth of research. But the courtroom was a different world now. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with the weight of Judge Reginald's disdain for Kofi's client. "Your Honor," Kofi began, his voice strong and unwavering, "we present a case of racial profiling and police brutality. There's a clear pattern of racial bias in the arresting officer's behavior, and it's our contention that my client's son was targeted because of the color of his skin." Judge Reginald's eyes narrowed, and a scowl marred his face. "I've seen enough of these cases, Mr. Kofi. It's nothing but a fishing expedition, and this court won't be swayed by emotion or racial rhetoric." Kofi's instincts sensed a trap. There was something beneath Judge Reginald's words, something that didn't quite add up. But he pushed on undeterred. "Your Honor, I assure you that this case is about facts and evidence. We've presented irrefutable proof that the arresting officer acted with racial bias. I implore the court to look beyond the racial undertones and see the truth in this case." Judge Reginald snorted. "I've looked at the evidence, Mr. Kofi, and I see nothing but a weak attempt to deflect blame. This case will not prevail." Kofi felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. Something wasn't right. But before he could explore this feeling further, he realized that it wasn't just the judge who seemed biased. It seemed like there were others in the courtroom, watching him with a sinister interest. As he delved deeper into the investigation, Kofi began to uncover a web of corruption that extended beyond the courtroom walls. It seemed that Judge Reginald had ties with the very men who were responsible for his parents' deaths. A connection that went all the way to the top, where it seemed that racial bias and prejudice had become systemic, woven into the fabric of justice itself. Kofi was torn between his outrage and his determination. He knew that he was onto something big, something that could shake the very foundations of the justice system. But he was alone, facing an opponent who would stop at nothing to silence him. As he stepped back into his office, Kofi couldn't shake the feeling that he had just scratched the surface of something much deeper and darker. He felt a surge of adrenaline, knowing that this case could potentially change the trajectory of his life. With each passing moment, Kofi's resolve grew stronger. He would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. He would take this fight to the very top, to the Supreme Court. He would make sure that justice was served, not just for his client, but for his parents, and for every black person who had ever been silenced by prejudice and bias. Kofi's eyes fell upon the small, ticking pocket watch that hung on a chain around his neck. It was a symbol of his journey, a reminder of the countless hours he had spent learning, striving, and fighting. But now it stood for something more. His unyielding commitment to justice, no matter the cost. As he looked up, Kofi knew that this case and his journey were far from over. He had taken the first step, a step that would lead him to the very apex of the justice system. He was ready to face whatever lay ahead, armed with his passion, his determination, and the knowledge that he was not alone. Together with his team, Kofi filed a petition to the Supreme Court, asking for the highest court in the land to review his case, and with it, the system of racial bias that had long been embedded in it. As they prepared for the journey ahead, Kofi couldn't help but feel a sense of hope, a hope that this time, justice might finally be served. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across Kofi's office. Piles of case files, legal briefs, and evidence papers covered his desk, a testament to the relentless pursuit of truth that had consumed him. But beneath the weight of his work lay a growing fear that he could no longer ignore, the fear that the men responsible for his parents' deaths were still powerful, still watching, and they would stop at nothing to eliminate him as well. Kofi's breakthrough, a thread of evidence connecting Judge Reginald and the men linked to his parents, made him realize that he had kicked a hornet's nest. The judge wasn't just a biased official. He was a figure intertwined with danger, a protector of secrets that could threaten Kofi's life. Little did he know, lurking in the shadows, the men who had taken everything from him were prepared to act. The first warning came late one evening, as Kofi stayed late at his office. The streets were quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead filling the silence. Suddenly, a shattering noise broke through the monotony, a window breaking. Kofi's heart raced as he turned, only to find a masked figure darting away into the darkness. A chill ran down his spine. Grabbing his jacket, Kofi bolted outside, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He followed the shadows, running through the alleyways of the city. The footsteps were fast and nimble, but Kofi was determined not to let this escape him. He had to know who had come for him, who had been sent by the men who had orchestrated his parents' murder. But the chase ended in an unexpected confrontation. As Kofi rounded a corner, he collided with a tall figure, thick-set and imposing. It was one of the men, Deacon, a known criminal with ties to the diamond syndicate that had swallowed his family whole. Kofi could see the smirk on his face, the gleam of malice in his eyes. "Thought you could run from us, kid?" Deacon sneered, cracking his knuckles. "You're digging too deep. You don't want to find out what happens to people who snoop around our business." The intimidation was palpable, but Kofi stood his ground, fueled by rage and grief. He wasn't about to let fear consume him. "You think you can silence me? You took my parents, and now you think you can take me too." Deacon let out a low laugh, stepping closer. "Your parents were just collateral damage in the bigger game, boy. And so will you be if you continue this foolishness. You're playing with fire." Kofi felt a surge of anger course through him. They weren't collateral damage. They were human beings, and I'll make you pay for what you did. But Deacon brushed off the threat, confidence oozing from every fiber of his being. "This struggle of yours, it'll only lead to your grave. We run this city, and you think some high-minded ideals about justice will save you. You're wrong." As Deacon turned to leave, something in Kofi snapped. "Wait, what happened to the diamond? The one that got your men killed?" Deacon paused, irritation spreading across his face. "You don't know when to quit, do you? Leave the past buried, boy. The diamond was never your business." He stepped away but turned back to Kofi with a sinister smile. "Just remember, if you dig too deep, you'll only find yourself 6 feet under." Kofi watched as Deacon disappeared into the shadows, understanding that this wasn't just a battle against the judge and a corrupt legal system. It was a fight against an entire underworld that had wanted his family silenced for too long. The realization of his precarious situation hit him hard. He was now marked. Back at his office, Kofi's mind raced. He needed a plan. The stakes were higher than he ever anticipated, and he knew that continuing his pursuit would not only put him at risk but also those he cared about. He couldn't let fear paralyze him. The truth about the diamond and the syndicate needed to come to light, not just for his safety, but in honor of his parents. With renewed determination, Kofi began to search for potential allies. He reached out to friends he had made during his time in the legal community, attempting to gather a team that would challenge not only the men who sought to silence him but also the systemic corruption still potent in the courts. One of his closest allies was Sophia, a fellow lawyer with a fierce commitment to civil rights. Over coffee one evening, Kofi laid out everything. His case, his parents' tragic death, and the threat now hanging over him. Sophia's expression shifted from sympathy to steely resolve as she absorbed the gravity of the situation. "We can't let them intimidate us," she affirmed. "We'll investigate this syndicate. We'll gather evidence, anything we can find. But you need to be careful, keep a low profile. If they want you dead, they'll come after you hard." Kofi nodded, the weight of their mission settling in his stomach. "I won't stop fighting, not when I've gotten this far. They think they can scare me. They think they can hide while their secrets unravel. We'll expose them for who they are." Underneath the mounting pressure and the chilling sense of danger, there flickered the flame of righteousness that had driven Kofi this far. With Sophia's support, they started to dig deeper, unearthed connections, and followed trails that led them closer to the powerful men behind the curtain. Late one night, while skimming through documents, Kofi stumbled upon the name of a pivotal figure. Mr. Sinclair, the man behind Deacon, who controlled the syndicate. A name that sent chills down his spine. Kofi knew that if he could connect Judge Reginald with Sinclair and the syndicate, they could build a case strong enough to bring down the entire corrupt operation. But danger lurked at every corner. One evening, while Kofi was wrapping up for the day, he felt a dark presence hover around him. As he stepped into the underground parking garage, his instincts kicked in. A figure emerged from the shadows. Light glinted off the barrel of a gun. "Hand over the files, kid." A voice growled from beneath a hood. Kofi's heart raced, but he couldn't let fear drown him. Not now, not when the truth was so close. "I won't," he shouted defiantly, his determination igniting a spark of courage within. "Then you'll pay," the figure snarled, stepping closer. Kofi made a split-second decision. He sprinted towards the nearest exit, adrenaline bubbling as he heard footsteps behind him. He raced through the garage, dodging parked cars, feeling his heart pound furiously in his chest. He burst into the open air, lungs gasping for breath, but he knew he couldn't stop. He had come too far. Kofi turned a corner, spotting two uniformed officers standing at the edge of the street. He sprinted toward them, the figure in pursuit hot on his heels. "Help! Please," he yelled, desperate. The officer quickly apprehended the assailant, and Kofi fell to his knees, panting, heart racing as he grasped the reality of his situation. The walls were closing in. Yet, within the chaos, a singular resolution took seed in his heart. He would not only fight for justice but also bring down those responsible for his parents' tragic fate. Kofi knew the path ahead would be fraught with danger, but with allies by his side, he was committed to facing the killers, unearthing every truth entwined with their sordid deeds in a fight for justice that went beyond his own safety. This wasn't just about himself anymore. This was about bringing an entire network of darkness into the light. The next phase of his journey had begun, and he was prepared to wage war against danger, corruption, and the powerful men who had taken everything from him while standing firm in the indomitable belief that the truth would always rise above. The courtroom was an arena of stark contrasts. High ceilings, gleaming wood, and polished marble, juxtaposed against the dark undercurrents that churned beneath the surface. Kofi stepped into the room, the weight of the moment hanging heavy on his shoulders. Today was the day he would confront not only Judge Reginald but also the shadowy figures that had haunted his past, the men responsible for his father's murder. Sophia walked beside him, her expression resolute. They had spent countless hours poring over evidence, assembling a case that would lay bare the corruption and bias at the heart of the city's justice system. The stakes had never been higher, and Kofi knew they faced a formidable adversary. As Kofi took his place at the plaintiff's table, the audience murmured, eyes shifting with curiosity. Deacon sat in the rear of the courtroom, his presence both menacing and mocking. Beside him was Mr. Sinclair, the mastermind behind the syndicate, shrouded in an aura of confidence, as if he believed the law was merely a game he could manipulate to his will. Kofi looked at the judge as he prepared to take the bench, a man whose face had been etched with disdain during previous sessions. Judge Reginald's gavel echoed in the room, silencing the crowd. "Order in the court," he intoned, his voice dripping with authority. "We will now proceed with the matter at hand." Kofi's pulse quickened as he stood. "Your Honor, I move to request a recusal due to your bias in this case," he said, his voice steady, though a tremor of uncertainty rippled beneath the surface. He met the judge's eyes, challenging him. Judge Reginald's brows furrowed, irritation flaring in his expression. You dare question my authority? Are you presenting evidence of this so-called bias? With a deep breath, Kofi's mind raced, steeling himself. I have uncovered connections between you, Mr. Sinclair, and the criminal activities that led to my parents' untimely deaths. You may think you control the narrative, but the truth will come out. A murmur swept through the courtroom, but the judge's face hardened, his fists clenching on the bench. This is a court of law, not a platform for your grandstanding, Mr. Kofi. If you lack evidence, I suggest you sit down. But Kofi pressed on, seizing the momentum. Evidence. I have more than enough evidence. He gestured to Sophia and their team, who began distributing printed documents across the court. Let me present to the court the affidavits detailing how Judge Reginald has been influenced by the Diamond Syndicate, including transactions indicating bribes taken to ensure biased rulings. The tension in the room thickened like a heavy fog, Judge Reginald's expression cold and unyielding. You are treading on dangerous ground. Kofi felt the weight of Deacon's glare from the back of the courtroom, but he remained unflinching. Dangerous ground is living in a city where corruption allows murderers to walk free. I am here to bring justice for my father, and I won't be silenced. Deacon stood abruptly, a sneer twisting his lips. You think you're brave, kid. You're nothing but a foolish boy seeking revenge. Those documents are meaningless. Kofi's heart raced, but he kept his composure. Meaningless. They detail your entire operation. They show how you profited off my family's loss. I have witnesses who can corroborate everything I say. Judge Reginald's voice cut through the chaos. Enough. You are out of order. I will not allow this circus to continue. Kofi met the judge's gaze head-on. You are the real circus, Your Honor. You stand before us, a figure of the law, yet you have sold out to those who would eliminate anyone who gets in their way. You are complicit. The courtroom erupted into chaos, murmurs and gasps swirling around them. Kofi caught sight of Sophia, nodding at him, her eyes encouraging. Your Honor, she interjected, stepping forward with a stack of documents, I would like to call a witness to the stand. Someone who has first-hand experience of Judge Reginald's actions in this case. Who do you intend to call? The judge growled, his irritation visible. I call Officer Lou Harris, Sophia declared, her voice ringing with authority. He was one of the first responders during the incident involving Kofi's father. The tense atmosphere crackled with uncertainty as Officer Harris stepped forward. His uniform crisp but his demeanor cautious. Kofi held his breath, hoping this was the turning point. Officer Harris, Sophia began. Can you recount the events leading to the death of Kofi's parents? With a firm nod, the officer spoke. I was assigned to the case. There was evidence to suggest that Mr. Kofi's father discovered something he shouldn't have, something to do with a diamond. Beneath the brow of the judge, Kofi could see the flicker of panic, though he masked it well. And did you report this information to your superiors? Harris hesitated, his conscience weighing heavily upon him. I reported everything, but the case was swept under the rug. I was told not to pursue it further, especially not against certain individuals. Kofi felt a surge of hope rising like a tide within him. Was the judge one of those individuals? The moment hung weighted in the air, every eye in the courtroom fixing on Harris, who swallowed hard before replying yes. I was instructed to keep the investigation from reaching Judge Reginald. Gasps filled the courtroom, and Kofi couldn't resist a slight smile. The walls of their corruption were beginning to crumble around them. Your Honor, Kofi pressed, this corroborates that you have acted outside your legal duties, and it demonstrates your connection to the syndicate. He pointed toward Deacon and Sinclair. These are the true perpetrators, the men who killed my father to keep their secrets hidden. Deacon seethed. This is absurd. You're throwing around accusations. Nothing more. Accusations backed up by evidence and 3 witnesses. Kofi snapped. He turned back to the judge, his voice rising with fervor. You have a choice, Reginald. You can continue to favor the corrupt or you can choose justice. This is your moment. You know the truth. Judge Reginald's face was a storm, a blend of fury and fear. Enough. You will not tarnish my courtroom with this nonsense. But it was too late. The tides had turned. Kofi could feel the weight of the room shifting around him, the intrigue of the public taking root. The truth was out, and it was spreading like wildfire. Your Honor, you cannot hide behind your robes anymore, Sophia shouted. The truth is now shining a light on your corrupt practices. We demand an investigation into you, the men behind the syndicate, and the circumstances surrounding Kofi's parents' murder. Kofi took a deep breath, his heart racing with exhilaration and fear. This is for my father. His death will not be in vain, and I will not rest until every last one of you is brought to justice. The gavel slammed against the desk, but it was drowned out by the cries of the public audience. They were the voice of change, the force that would no longer tolerate the corruption overshadowing their lives. Kofi locked eyes with Deacon and Sinclair, a promise burning brightly there, a promise that he would fight until every chain binding him to his past was broken. And as the courtroom erupted in chaos, Kofi knew they had ignited a movement, one that would rise against the very foundations of corruption, lighting a path toward a brighter future, where justice prevailed over fear. This battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Kofi felt the weight of hope lifting from his shoulders. The fight for justice had truly begun, and he was ready to face whatever came next. The gavel slammed down with a finality that echoed through the courtroom, an arresting sound that marked the end of Kofi's fiery stand against corruption. Judge Reginald's voice rang with dismissive authority, devoid of empathy or consideration for the truth. This case is closed. It's over, you can go. The words felt like a knife to Kofi's heart, the air around him thick with disillusionment. It was crushing, a bitter conclusion to a battle he had fought tirelessly, only to be scorned by the very system he had believed would uphold justice. He stood there for a moment, the weight of despair pressing down like a lead cloak. Sophia placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but Kofi's gaze was distant, locked onto the floor as his mind raced with frustration. Memories of his father flooded back, reminders of the sacrifice that had brought him to this moment. The fight had become so much more than personal vengeance. It was about truth, integrity, and the lives that had been upended by greed and corruption. But as Kofi turned to leave the courtroom, something shifted within him. Deep breaths rode the tides of defiance as he realized that the judge's dismissal would not dictate the end of his story. This system, tainted and unjust, might have crushed him momentarily, but it would never break his spirit. He walked out of those doors, heart pounding, but a newfound resolve stirred within him. Outside, the sun glowed brightly against the slate gray of the courthouse, illuminating the path ahead. Kofi knew he would not let the fight end here. Named by the darkness of deceit, he was now forged by an unwavering light of determination. With renewed vigor, Kofi threw himself into a vast sea of research and investigation. He combed through files, gathered every scrap of evidence he had amassed during his time in the courtroom, the affidavits from Officer Harris, documents from his parents' accounts, and testimonies from the affected community members. Every piece was vital, each connection a thread woven into the larger tapestry of corruption he intended to unravel. Reaching out to legal experts became a primary goal. With Sophia's guidance, Kofi compiled information on renowned judges known for their integrity, those who had a reputation for standing against injustice, no matter the cost. Email after email, call after call, he recounted his experiences, attaching evidence like breadcrumbs leading them toward a trail of accountability. As a community began to coalesce around him, Kofi's efforts gained traction. Media outlets began picking up on the story, a young boy standing up against corruption, each report echoing with the voice of a warrior fighting for truth and justice. The story resonated, stirring something deep within those who had once accepted their fates in silence. People came forward, their tales of being wronged spilling out like a floodgate burst open. Each narrative built upon the other, forming an unbreakable bond of solidarity. With the flood of testimonies came strength. Higher judges, moved by the burgeoning movement, began to take notice. They reached out to Kofi directly, impressed by his tenacity and the evidence he had collected. The tide began to shift. Together, they investigated the corruption that ran deeper than anyone had previously imagined. Witnesses were called, records reviewed, and the true extent of the crimes committed by powerful figures was unearthed. Months of relentless pursuit culminated in a hearing at a higher court, an opportunity Kofi had dreamed of but never imagined would materialize. The courtroom was packed with supporters, faces familiar and unfamiliar, each person bearing witness to the moment he had worked so hard to achieve. The judges on the bench listened intently, their demeanor serious yet fair. Kofi stood in the center of the room, bolstered by the strength of those who had come forward. He spoke passionately, weaving the tales of loss, injustice, and corruption into a narrative painted with a vibrant brush of hope. This is more than my family's story. This is about every individual whose voice has been silenced, every life that has been shattered by deceit. We deserve a system that protects us, not one that shields the corrupt. The palpable tension in the room shifted as Kofi's words settled over the audience, the judges thoughtfully exchanging glances. When the ruling finally came, it felt as if the air had been sucked from the room in collective anticipation. We find merit in the claims presented and declare that the case against Judge Reginald and his accomplices must be reopened, the lead judge announced, authority lining his voice. Kofi felt tears of relief sting the corners of his eyes. This was the battle he had fought for, the justice he had sought for so long. In the days that followed, the renewed investigation unraveled a web of corruption that ran deeper than Kofi had ever anticipated. As the truth came to light, powerful figures fell. Deacon Sinclair, and even Judge Reginald faced severe consequences for their actions, their empire of deceit crumbling like a house of cards. But Kofi understood that this victory was not merely personal. It sparked a beacon of hope for others, shining brightly against the backdrop of systemic corruption, proof that the fight for justice was both necessary and possible. Through his journey, he exhibited resilience and courage. The once silent voices of many now sang in a choir for accountability, challenging the status quo and standing tall in the face of adversity. People began to rise and demand justice, igniting a movement that transformed their community, a continuum of courage inspired by one boy's resolve to stand against corruption. Years later, Kofi would often return to that courtroom, not as a boy filled with grief, but as a man transformed by his fight for justice. He spoke to crowds, continuing to advocate for the unheard and for structural change. He inspired a generation to take a stand, to refuse silence in the face of injustice, to believe that truth would always pave the way for a better future. And in the heart of the community he'd fought for, the spirit of his father lived on, a legacy intertwined with every life touched by his determination to confront and conquer the corruption that had sought to take everything from him. Kofi had found his purpose, a guardian of truth, a champion for those who feared to speak out, a symbol of undying hope. His journey proved that while battles may be lost in the pursuit of justice, the spirit can never be broken. Years had passed since the courtroom battle that had reshaped Kofi's life and the lives of those around him. The world had changed in ways he hadn't imagined, but so had he. He wasn't the same boy who had walked into that courtroom, fueled by anger and grief. Now he was a man, tempered by the fires of experience, shaped by the lessons of the past, and more determined than ever to continue the fight for justice. His office was cluttered with stacks of legal documents, case files, and messages from those who had found his work inspiring. But despite the support and recognition he had gained, there was always more to be done. Justice was a relentless pursuit, one that didn't come with a finish line, and Kofi was acutely aware of this. It was both his calling and his burden. The phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Sophia. She had been his rock throughout the years, his confidant, his partner in this crusade for justice. Kofi, Sophia's voice was steady but urgent. I just received a tip about something. It's bigger than what we've faced before. I need you to come to the office. We need to discuss this. Kofi's heart quickened. Every new case brought its own set of challenges, but this felt different. He had seen corruption in all its forms, but what Sophia was describing hinted at something far more insidious. He grabbed his coat and headed to her office, his mind racing with possibilities. As he entered, Sophia greeted him with a solemn expression. "Sit down," she said. "I've been in touch with some of the key figures in the activist network. There's been a rise in covert corruption, hidden behind layers of government bureaucracy. Powerful people are moving in the shadows, pulling strings that are impacting every facet of our society." Kofi sat, his thoughts momentarily overwhelmed. He had fought the visible, the obvious, but this was something different. It wasn't just one corrupt individual or group. It was the system itself, festering from the inside out. Sophia continued. "They've infiltrated organizations we thought were untouchable. The judicial system, the media, the corporations. And it's more than just a few bad apples. It's a network that's pulling strings, shaping public opinion, and protecting itself." Kofi leaned forward, his resolve hardening. He had seen this before. Small acts of corruption growing into something far more dangerous, far more destructive. But he had learned a valuable lesson over the years. Corruption thrives in silence. It flourishes when good people remain complacent, when they believe that one small act of dishonesty or greed won't make a difference. But he knew better. Every act, no matter how small, created a ripple. And those ripples, when left unchecked, could turn into waves. "We have to expose it," Kofi said, his voice firm. "But this time we need to be more strategic. We can't afford to go in blind like we did before. We have to build a coalition, gather every ally we have, work with the people who've been trying to fight the system from the inside. This won't be easy, but we've done impossible things before." Sophia nodded. "I've already started reaching out to trusted contacts. But we'll need more information, evidence, and public support. We're going to need a movement that's bigger than just the two of us." Kofi stood up, his mind already formulating a plan. This was no longer about personal revenge or individual justice. It was about dismantling a system that was designed to protect the corrupt and keep the oppressed silent. It was about restoring integrity to a society that had allowed greed to cloud its moral compass. Over the next few months, Kofi and Sophia worked tirelessly. They gathered evidence, met with whistleblowers, and spoke with individuals who had been directly impacted by the corruption. The more they uncovered, the more shocking it became. Powerful figures had been manipulating the law, controlling the media to shape public opinion, and using their wealth to suppress any attempt at real change. But Kofi had learned something essential during his journey. Truth is its own weapon. It was often the quietest voices that made the loudest impact. The truth had a way of breaking through even the thickest walls of deception. The trick was to make sure that truth found its way to the people, that it was shared widely and clearly, and that those who had been silenced were given the platform they deserved. As the network of people who supported Kofi's cause grew, so did the stakes. Kofi knew that every step he took, every piece of information he uncovered, would be met with resistance from those in power. But he also knew that the tide of history was on his side. Justice had a way of prevailing, even if it was a slow and painful process. The day of the press conference arrived. The room was packed with journalists, activists, and community members who had come to hear what Kofi and his team had uncovered. Kofi stood at the podium, his heart racing but his mind clear. He looked out at the sea of faces, knowing that they were all there for the same reason, to hear the truth. "This is not just my fight," he began, his voice steady. "It's the fight of every person who has been wronged, every voice that has been silenced, and every system that has been manipulated by those in power. We have gathered the evidence, and it is clear. The corruption that runs deep within our society has been hidden for too long. But today we stand together to expose it." Kofi laid out the evidence, each piece more damning than the last. The room was silent as the weight of what he was saying began to sink in. But then, something incredible happened. One by one, people began to speak up. Whistleblowers, community members, and even former insiders came forward, adding their voices to Kofi's. The truth was no longer just his. It was everyone's. The media, once complicit in the corruption, began to report on the story, and public opinion began to shift. People who had once been apathetic or fearful now found their courage. Protests erupted in the streets, and the pressure on the corrupt officials grew unbearable. Kofi's movement had grown into something unstoppable. The lesson that Kofi had learned over the years, and one that he shared with everyone who joined his cause, was this. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when people come together, when they refuse to accept the status quo, and when they use their collective voice to demand accountability. Kofi had once believed that justice was something you could achieve through a single victory in court. But he had come to realize that justice was a journey, one that required persistence, collaboration, and above all, an unwavering commitment to truth. In the end, it wasn't just about taking down a few bad actors. It was about transforming a broken system. And as the days passed, Kofi realized that the true victory wasn't the defeat of corruption. It was the awakening of a people who had long been silenced, who now stood united in their belief that change was possible. As Kofi watched the movement unfold before him, he knew one thing for sure: the fight for justice would never be over. But he also knew that as long as people continued to stand up, as long as the truth was heard, there would always be a chance for a better future.